Thank you so much, Bill. It's always great to be with you all. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Devereaux. As Bill mentioned, I'm the former head of executive development for Google, 14-year Google veteran. I actually just left in January of this year. These days, I'm heading up my own coaching and advisory business, Third Coast Coaching, and I'm also heading up marketing and customer success, because why not, for a SaaS startup called Murmur that's based here out of Colorado. But today I'm here to talk to you about performance management. And this is a topic that is truly near and dear to my heart. After 14 years at Google, 12 of which as a people manager, as I'm sure you can imagine, I spent a ton of time thinking about performance and feedback and participating in the process, both as a manager as well as an individual contributor. And before leaving Google, I had this amazing opportunity to actually step into a part-time temporary special assignment to fully revamp Google's entire performance management approach. So I spent 6 months working with this incredible team of people to really start from scratch and think about how do we want to rework every element. So the whole thing was getting a makeover, really. The tool, the process, job profiles, comms, philosophy, soup to nuts, start to finish, no stone left unturned. So it was really exciting. And it gave me a peek into performance management culture and the process and the way that we did it at Google that I really hadn't experienced before. I hadn't been behind the curtain, and it got me thinking a lot about what we needed to be doing differently. I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to making sure that our behaviors match our intentions. It's something that I focus a lot on in my coaching business, as well as something that I spent a lot of time on in Google's Google School for Leaders. So this was a core component of what we talked about in leadership development at Google. And it seemed to me that when it came to performance management and feedback, we were honestly missing the mark. So I started thinking about why. Why was that happening? And what could we experiment with that would help us close the gap? So I'm excited to share some of these ideas with you today. This is a totally new talk and new topic for me. So honestly, I'm just excited to see what you all think and engage in, I'm sure, what will be some spirited conversations later on in the program at the Colleague Cafe. Okay, so before we jump in, I just want to take a moment to reflect. So we're not going to do a live poll, but take a second to just reflect on when it comes to getting performance management wrong. What are you afraid of? Oh, we are going to do a live poll. Look at that. Thank you, Ben. So take another 2 seconds, 3 seconds to log your answers if you haven't already. If it's nothing, don't participate. Okay, it looks like a few things are moving around, but generally, employee engagement and motivation will suffer is sticking in that top spot. People won't be fairly rewarded for their work. That's something I used to hear quite a lot as well. Great. Okay, let's pop back to the presentation. I agree with you. I think that's totally spot on. I think all of these things are potentially things that would happen if we don't get performance management, quote unquote, right. And I would offer that regardless of what we do, they're probably going to happen anyway. So you see, I believe that there is no right when it comes to performance management. This is a complex system of individual intertwining behaviors, motivations, emotions. And when we try to control a complex system, when we try to apply supposed best practices to something that's not like anything that we've done before, it backfires spectacularly. And the reality is that performance management at any moment in time, at any company, in my humble opinion, is not the same from cycle to cycle. It's never the same because you have different people participating, you have different emotions, you have different things that are happening within the environment. You can never replicate the results reliably cycle over cycle. So what do? We put all of these frameworks and rubrics and rating systems and calibrations and all of these different safeguards in place to try to decrease, to try to eliminate even some of these things that are up on the slide. And the question that I keep wrestling with is like, is that actually working? Or are we just making them harder to see? Are we lulling ourselves into a false sense of security with all of this stuff that actually doesn't get at a lot of what you see here, but just hides it? It makes it harder for us to identify what's really going on. There's really, again, no way to predict what's actually going to work. But one thing that I do know that does work when it comes to motivating people and engaging people, which has been demonstrated over and over again through decades of research, is trust. And trust is a really funny thing in HR. We talk about it and we promote it all the time. Leadership development, employee engagement initiatives, team effectiveness interventions. Trust is everywhere. Trust is the thing that we need to do for the future of work. And it's oddly absent from performance management. I started wondering why that is. Why do we build these incredibly complicated processes and rules around performance that are, in effect, trying to prevent or catch what we consider to be bad behavior? In so many aspects of how we as culture builders within the HR community create spaces for employee greatness, we offer and encourage trust. Why isn't this the case when it comes to performance? Why do we seem caught in this cycle of designing for bad actors? What would happen if we didn't just trust, but we trusted first? So I was chatting with Bill and the team before we went live here, and I have a 5-year-old, and my husband has her and my 1-year-old outside, so that it's nice and quiet in here today. But it's not normally quiet, and so sometimes we sit down in front of the TV. And we were watching Raya and the Last Dragon, which is the new Disney movie, just a couple days ago. And if you've got kids, it's an amazing show. If you don't have kids, it's honestly a really great movie. It's very well done. And the thing that I thought was so lovely about it was that it was all about trust. It was all about trusting and trusting first. Someone has to go first. What would it look like if we were first when it came to performance management? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about trust and some of the pretty incredible benefits that it offers us. So one, our top concern is engagement. When people feel trusted, they feel like they have a stake in the work, a stake in their team, more influence and, control, not necessarily control. What do I want to say there? Influence and maybe just influence over the decisions that really affect their work, right? That's a motivator. I am part of what creates my work environment and what creates my day-to-day. It also increases innovation. When people feel trusted, they know that their ideas and the things that they bring to the table will really be considered and respected. And when they know that, they'll spend more time thinking through how to solve complex problems, brainstorming, and coming up with innovative solutions. If they don't think that their ideas are going to be looked at or seriously considered, they're not going to put in the effort. And then the last one that I want to highlight is quality. So this one gets overlooked a lot when we talk about trust. And quality is a result of trusting people. Human beings generally want to do a good job. And I've talked about this at HCI conferences before. Nobody wakes up one morning or every morning and says, hey, I'm going to go to work today and I'm going to spend 7 or 8 hours doing that. And I'd like to really be bad at it. I'd like to really suck today. That's a great goal. Nobody wants to do that. And it's why in volunteer programs, so G2G, Googlers to Googlers, was a volunteer program that I built and ran at Google for about 5 years. And in volunteer programs where there is no real performance management, if you trust people, the quality just goes through the roof because you've got that motivation for the work and you've also got the trust from the people who are running the ship. In general, low quality work, in my experience, and again, humble opinion, is the result of kind of two main motivation killers. One, a toxic environment where employees don't feel valued, trusted, or empowered. Or two, a broken hiring process where we don't catch at the top of the funnel that someone isn't going to be a good fit. They're not going to be successful. I mentioned G2G and that it was basically this volunteer learning network where people would volunteer their time to teach each other. And there's about 11,000 employees participating globally today across every Google location. And our quality scores were exceptional. We honestly had higher quality scores in a lot of cases than some of our external facilitators, because Googlers just loved having that Google to Google connection, people that really understood what they were going through on the ground. And I always used to get this question of well, how are you basically managing performance? What's your quality assurance process? And my answer was always well, why do I need one? Because this looks great. What I do, what this program does, is we intervene at particular moments in time when we notice a slip in metrics and we say, hey, how you doing? Do you need some help? It looks like, you might be struggling in these areas. How can we better support you? It doesn't have that same feel as let's give you this rubric, let's have you measure yourself against it, and then let's go through and talk about all the things you did right, but mostly all the things you did wrong. So it has this different feeling of guidance and support and care and trust that motivates people to do exceptional things. So speaking of Google, let's talk about Google for a couple of minutes here. And I want to talk about the history of performance management at Google. When I started at Google in 2006, the company was only 7 years old. We had 6,500 employees globally, and we were super, super scrappy, which translated basically into disorganized and inconsistent. When I left, we were approaching our 25th birthday. We had 140,000 global employees company-wide, and we had processes and frameworks and tools that had been standardized and scaled across the entire company. I watched as Google really underwent this explosive growth, and I participated in this process of trying to evolve and mature our systems to match that growth as we struggled to kind of quote unquote grow up. But with each reboot, redesign, revamp of the perf system, I noticed that 3 things were happening as we started to make some of these shifts. So one, we were getting more consistent in our approach, and we were getting more formal and, mature in the way that we handled feedback. But we were also getting more frustrated with the process. So I want to talk a little bit about what that looked like. So what you have here is a very rough timeline of what I would say has some artistic interpretation on it. So this is all, somewhat ancient history at this point in the grand scheme of Google. So these are approximations in terms of dates and in terms of actual numbers. So the years are about right for where we were at any one point. There were so many experiments going on at Google when it came to performance management. We were constantly trying something that 2009 for one group within engineering actually might have looked really different than it did for a group in sales, because we were constantly trying to improve this. It was a thing that employees kept telling us was concerning. And so it was something that they didn't like about working at Google, was hampering their motivation and their engagement. So we kept working on it. So please take all of this for illustrative purposes and not necessarily as gospel. So in 2006, back when I started, Perf was at Perf, as we called it, was actually quarterly. So we were doing this every quarter, and it was a full cycle every quarter. It was self-assessments, it was manager reviews, it was peer reviews. It was intense. But it only took 4 weeks from the time that you submitted your peer review requests all the way until you would talk to your manager. Generally only took about a month. So it was pretty fast, even though we were doing it every quarter. The rating scale had 40 different ratings in it, which was pretty intense. We didn't have a ton of rubrics. If we did, they were super inconsistent. They didn't really carry over from quarter to quarter sometimes. There were changes all the time. No team was using the same one. Job profiles, I don't even think I saw a job profile for what I was supposed to be doing until about 2010. So job profiles weren't exactly a thing either. And feedback was really informal. Like, you would just kind of like sit in the cube and, do your performance review with your manager and just kind of chat things through. It wasn't like this structured process. 2009, things got a little less frequent, a little longer, ratings got a little smaller, but rubrics and job profiles started to pop up a little bit. 2014, we were still at semi-annual. Things were getting longer though, because ratings were decreasing and rubrics and job profiles continued to increase. We had fewer measurements, but we were measuring against more things. And then by 2019, we had an annual review process that was about 12 weeks from submitting your first peer review all the way to getting your manager review. But we only had a 3-point scale, but 2 to 4, kind of team to org rubrics and centralized job profiles for the entire company, if it had actually happened, which I'll talk about. So that was the vision for 2019. The reality was a little bit different. So this progression, I think, really illustrates a pretty serious trade-off that Google may not have realized that we were making. Less frequent, but longer cycles, less rating differentiation, but more things to be rated on, and more formal feedback that was honestly like being delivered far less frequently. I think we had this vision that we were going to inspire informal feedback, right? Like in between these formal performance cycles. And it just it kind of never really happened. I think the formality of the cycles themselves just really took over. So I want to say that not only were all of these changes incredibly well intentioned, but they were really well informed too. Google had years of consistent and extremely diligently analyzed employee engagement data informing all of these changes. This is what everybody said they wanted as we were moving towards this vision of that we thought of in 2019. It all looked really excellent on paper, but in practice, it was just lacking something. People were still obsessing over ratings. There just weren't as many to obsess over. They were still trying to game the system. They had just found different loopholes. They were still struggling with feedback, just in different ways, and they were still frustrated. So much so that the latest Perf Revamp, that one that I worked on, as I said, never launched. 2 years, dozens of incredibly talented, well-intentioned, well-informed Googlers working on it, great ideas that spanned all aspects of the system, and it never launched. Honestly, habits around Perf were just way too entrenched. And people were resistant to let go of aspects of the process that they had gotten used to and learned to tolerate. The idea of taking any of that away was really scary for a lot of folks. It was something that they could rely on. And understandably so, right? Performance management, performance ratings, the way that you structure how you manage and reward performance it's not just a rating on a piece of paper. Like these are people's lives. This is their livelihood that we're talking about. So when we do a whole overhaul, even if it's something that really looks great and we think is going to have a lot of great effects, it's scary because it changes something that we're used to that's tied to our bank accounts. So as I said, 2019 never launched. But we did end up changing a few things. So Perf in 2021 looks pretty similar to the way that it looked in 2014 with a few changes. We made it longer because there was more to measure. So we did roll out more rubrics. We continued to work towards centralization, but not fully centralize job profiles. But not much else made it out the door. We still had the 5-point scale. It was still semi-annual. And as we actually ended up in this situation, as you can see, we were spending 24 weeks a year on Perf, which is a full 8 weeks longer than we did on average back in 2006, even when Perf was quarterly. If we had gotten everything out the door, it would have been a net decrease, but we didn't. Now, I want to stress that this was an insanely talented team. These were some of the best people that I ever worked with, and they did so much right. The research, the executive sponsorship, the support for our manager community to get better at feedback and to roll out these changes with their teams. It was all so incredibly well done. And who knows, if we hadn't been set to launch a month into the pandemic, April of 2020, maybe it would have been different. But at a time when everything felt unstable, Perf was a constant. It was something that people could hold on to, that they understood, and they had come to tolerate, yes, but as I said before, also rely on. And taking that away just wasn't a good call. And honestly, I think Google made the right call to pump the brakes, regardless of what had been invested thus far. So I want to gear shift a little bit, and I want to pause on this notion of unintended consequences. In complexity, there are so many connections, so many tendrils that reach out into a system, that every decision, every change can impact things in ways that we just never saw coming. And I would say that on the whole, we are getting better at operating in a highly complex world. To be frank, our survival as a species depends on it. But big changes within complex systems can still present unexpected challenges and unintended consequences. So let's talk through a few of those. Despite our best intentions, here are a few things that I have seen and continue to see kind of pop up within performance management systems. So one, self-promoters have the advantage. Whether we want to admit it or not, people who are good at talking, who are comfortable at talking about themselves, and who feel good about managing up and promoting their work without a huge level of humility are going to do better in a lot of our performance management systems, because so much of it is based on written reporting. One of the things that I used to do at Google that I really appreciated that Google invested in was helping ESLs, so English as a second language employees, write their performance reviews. We used to do this huge volunteer effort through the G2G program every cycle, where G2Gers would volunteer to sit down with ESL employees and help them write about themselves. So there are things you can do, but generally, the folks who are comfortable in this space are going to have the upper hand. Priorities are based on perf and promo cycles. So this is a trend that I've noticed in multiple areas of my businesses. I had a client actually recently who was talking about, well, I don't really want to work on this project, but I need to because it's really shiny and it's going to get finished. It's going to launch right in time for promo. And so it's really just the perfect thing. And I can just suffer through for the next 6 to 7 months so that I can be in really good shape to include it in my promo packet. It's not the best way to choose what work needs to get done and where we put our focus. Collaboration is used as a competitive tool. So in many of our frameworks that we have out there about how to get work done, we talk about collaboration and working with others and making sure that, you know, you're good at it and you're doing it on a regular basis. And so what ends up happening is that people often will look for collaboration opportunities in places where they're not necessary, and they're just doing it in order to gain a competitive advantage in the performance management process. So one of the things that actually got published externally that you may have heard of at Google was something called the collaboration headwind. And it focused on this element of like seeking out collaboration for the sake of collaboration instead of doing it when it actually makes a difference. Feedback is seen as a threat. Very briefly, when, you know, feedback might end up, you know, any piece of feedback might end up in your performance review. You are less likely to be receptive to it. You are less likely to seek it out. You are more likely to see it as a negative instead of an opportunity for growth. Unhealthy comparisons and competitions with peers. Why did that person get promoted over me? Like, I got meets expectations. I know that like 6 of my friends, you know, who do a similar job got higher ratings than I did. Why am I not as good as they are? A lot of that comes up, particularly with folks who are earlier in their career. And then development is about moving up and not growth. And I think that's the saddest one for me as a learning and development enthusiast and someone who's committed to that space for life. It's about figuring out like, what are those boxes I need to check on the attribute list in order to move up the ladder, whether that's performance rating or promo, not about where I need to grow and what I need to be focused on for my own learning. So just a quick reflection. How does your performance process make you feel? Just take a minute. List out as many as you can. We'll take about 10 seconds. Wow. Okay, let's pop back to the slide. So consistent with the words that I heard when I asked this question to a handful of folks recently, colleagues and friends. And here's what they told me. They told me a lot of the things that you just told me. What patterns do you notice here? How does just looking at what your peers just put into the chat there and what you see in this word cloud, how does this make you feel now looking at it? And then, is this how we want people to feel when they think about our performance management? I don't think so. And my big question is like, what are we losing out on? What are we risking in business by allowing emotions like this to continue? And what I really worry about, honestly, is that a lot of these words, a lot of these emotions are very closely tied to mental health concerns and to burnout, which we know is a huge problem right now that is not being adequately addressed. So what I'm proposing is a new way for many of us of thinking about performance. We know that our workforce is more burnt out than ever before. We know that people are craving supportive working environments where they can be themselves, grow their skills, and feel safe to raise concerns and share their opinions. What if the key to solving burnout isn't well-being training or self-care benefits? What if it's not about improving team effectiveness or even shifting leadership mindsets? What if the secret to a sustainable, healthy, happy, productive workforce lies with performance management? I think, at least in part, that it might. So let's talk about burnout for just a second. I want to make sure we're all working with the same definition. There are 6 causes of burnout: unsustainable workload, perceived lack of control, insufficient rewards for effort, lack of a supportive community, lack of fairness, mismatched values and skills. And when I look at this list, so much of this feels like it's either caused or at least heavily influenced by a lack of trust somewhere in the system. So again, how might we trust first? Okay, great. We've painted quite the picture, right? But where do we start? If we are truly to shed the frameworks, the rubrics, the ratings, what do we replace them with? I don't know entirely. But I have a couple of ideas of where we might begin the journey. And I think a big part of it is that we need to approach performance management from the perspective of human motivation and growth versus monitoring and measurement, to believe in people and to trust them first and foremost. I love this quote by Wilma Rudolph, a record-breaking track and field 1960 Olympic champion. She was truly exceptional, the first American woman to win 3 gold medals in a single Olympiad. She said, "Never underestimate the power of dreams and the influence of the human spirit. We are all the same in this notion. The potential for greatness lives within each of us. What would it look like if we nurtured the greatness within each and every employee? What environment do we need to create to bring out the best in folks? And as we actually say at Murmur, help them to do the best work of their lives. How can we shift performance to be more about development, about growth, about learning, about belonging? We've tried to separate these things in the past. I'm not so sure that's a good idea. And I know it's not getting us where we want to go. What if performance was focused on growing employees for the future instead of rewarding or punishing them for the past? Whew. Okay, with all that in mind, here are a couple of tangible places where I think we could better focus our efforts. Autonomy. If you give folks the freedom to make decisions, they will take more ownership over their work, their productivity will increase, they'll produce better quality stuff, and lo and behold, performance will improve. Psych safety. This is something we've talked about a lot at Google over the years. If anybody's familiar with what we called Project Aristotle or G teams, I think externally, psychological safety is the key to team effectiveness. If you've got unclear roles and responsibilities, like if you've got not the best accountability, like all over, between your team members, it's not as detrimental as not having good psychological safety. And you know what a really big component of psychological safety is? It's that, 5-letter word, trust. If people feel like they belong, if they feel respected and heard and seen, that they can safely share their concerns and ideas, they'll show up without fear in exceptional ways, which again, improves performance. And then finally, transparency. I think that as we've tried to get better at feedback, we've actually gotten worse at honesty. If you tell people what's actually happening openly, honestly, and without judgment, they'll respond. It needs to be frequent enough for them to act, not months, let's say 3 months after it actually happens. But they need to know that you're coming from a place of support and care, not trying to catch them. They need to know that they won't be punished for having an open and honest conversation that maybe exposes an area of growth for them. So in my last minute here, I'd love to just share a few questions that I think it's worth all of us considering, regardless of whether you agree or are intrigued with what I shared or not. I think these are questions that we should always be asking ourselves if we are at the helm of performance management for our organizations. Is our performance management process helping us meet our people goals, worth the time investment, leading to unintended consequences, creating negative feelings, or helping us to nurture better ways of working? And finally, the one thing that you want to change. And I would encourage everyone to try to write that down before the end of today. What's the one thing that you want to change about performance management within your organization? And I'd love to hear some of your answers for those of you who might want to join me at the Colleague Cafe at 12:15. I think it's 12:15 Eastern. Okay. That's all I got, folks. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your attention. I hope at least that sparked some ideas in all of you. And I can't wait to continue the conversation. Thanks for having me.